Great. Good morning, everybody. Climate change is challenging, but trying to say something new as the fourth speaker of a panel on the third day, that too without a video, is truly challenging, but I'll try. I'm going to talk about private foundations, foundations in general, and climate change and climate finance. The official title is Foundations in Climate Change. Before I do that, though, Asia Foundation has been in the banner for 3 days. We haven't had the chance to introduce the organization to the audience. So let me just take a minute, maybe less, and introduce the Asia Foundation. The Asia Foundation is an international nonprofit organization. As the name suggests, we're in Asia, in 18 countries in Asia and in the United States. It's quite an interesting geography in the sense that in the north we're in Mongolia, in the south we're all the way down to the Pacific Islands, and similarly on the east-west axis from Korea to Afghanistan. Luckily in South Asia we have operations in all 8 South Asian countries. In Bhutan the operations are managed by Nepal office, and in Maldives it is managed by Sri Lanka office. There are 5 areas in which we work: governance, economy, environment and climate, women's empowerment, and international cooperation. We've been in existence for, I think, 70 years or so. All right, with that, let me get to the matter. I'm going to talk about foundations. There are different ways in which foundations are defined and operated in different countries. And almost every country has laws regulating foundations. So it's very difficult to say, how foundations are defined in specifics. But in general, we could think of 2 sort of clusters. One is the endowed grant-making foundations, and the other is public foundations which are not endowed and would draw resources from different sources. The Asia Foundation happens to be the second kind. Just to give you a picture of what it looks like, the world of foundations. The top 100 foundations across the globe have a total endowment of $658 billion. Now, mind you, I said 100. There are more than 100,000 family and private foundations across the globe. 658 billion is the Argentinian GDP. That means it's the 23rd largest economy, is top 100 foundations. If you add all the 100,000, I think we're talking almost like 6th largest economy in the world. So where is their power? Their power is that 50% of their endowment is in equity investments. If collectively all 100 decide that they will stop investing in high-emission industries and businesses, there will be a shockwave through the world. But that hasn't happened yet. What else hasn't happened? That if you think about how much of their givings or their donations go to climate action, it is nothing, it's paltry. In the US in 2020, the US foundations dispensed $64 billion to different organizations as grants. Of that, only 320 million went to climate action. Why is that so? There are no clear answers. I can offer some explanations, but they may or may not be right. First of all, there is a big difference between the foundations that were created in the 1950s and 70s and the foundations that are being created today. A lot of the wealth accumulation today happens in the tech industry. In those days, it was coal, oil and gas, auto, steel, and things like that. So naturally, the endowments that have been generated from profits from those operations have a different outlook on climate change than the ones that we talk about, the Gates, the Bezos, the Scholes, and things like that. So the attitudes are a little different. And we believe that will be transformed someday. In terms of what happens if more goes to climate, well, obviously, the next item as in the largest item that the $64 billion went to in the United States is on education. So there you see a trade-off. If more is drawn into climate, obviously other sectors will suffer. So that we need to keep in mind. Let me go to the public foundations now. There are operating foundations which implement programs. There are grant-making foundations, but most public foundations today are hybrid foundations. And we don't need to worry about foundations that are location-specific or country-specific because they do their activities and spending in their own countries. But being in South Asia and today in Bhutan, I think it's more important to look at what the foundations that work across boundaries or international foundations. So in that sense, the international public foundations are roughly international nonprofits, and that's the term I will use. Now, there is good news there too. There was a survey, a global survey, that showed 3 in 10 adults across the globe have a propensity to give some donation every year on a routine basis. And there is another survey done in 40 countries that shows 54% of the global population, or the population in 40 countries, support urgent climate action. You put the two together, there is scope to find more money, private givings for climate action, even through individual donations. And that hasn't been mobilized as well as it should be. The other item that I want to put out is the cost of net zero transition by 1950 is significantly more. It was mentioned here between 3 to 6 trillion. My figure is 3.5 trillion, and that's a big amount. Now, we often forget what is the global GDP. So 2021, global GDP was around 97 trillion. And so when we talk about 100 billion, that's less than 1/10 of 1%. And if we can't mobilize that, and that we have endless discussions about how to mobilize that, we're not really talking sense in some ways. So we need to change this frame and see what else we can do from the private sector. Now let me talk about climate very quickly. In the first session of this conference, we had Professor Adil Nazam talking about age of adaptation. And in his keynote, he said, well, climate change has arrived, and from here on forth, we're in the age of adaptation. I want to emphasize one particular element of his thought here, which is the idea of casting this in an epochal manner, with an epochal connotation, has meaning. When we say age of adaptation, we're almost saying similar reference to when we say Bronze Age that started 5,000 years ago, or Iron Age that started 3,000 years ago. Why? Because we know the global warming scenarios till 2100, right? And it could be anywhere between 2.5 to 4.5 or whatever the scientists are thinking right now, or will begin to think maybe in different terms later. But we have no understanding of what the reversal time is. What does that mean? It's not going to reverse, at least not soon. That means for at least 2 centuries, we're in the age of adaptation. I say 2 just as a conjecture. We know at least for 1 century, which is 2100s, all across, we will be adapting. And what does that mean is what I'm going to briefly talk about here. So the IPCC has identified 127 potential climate risks. These risks, the exposure is not even, neither is the vulnerability even. When I say exposure is not even, what does that mean? For instance, sea level rise. It's not going to affect Bhutan, but it's going to affect Maldives. But similarly, it's going to affect Pacific Island countries, right? So, the exposure to these variety of sort of risks are differently located. And that's why location has begun to matter. Similarly, vulnerability. In Maldives, for instance, the upper class, wealthier Maldivians have already bought land in Sri Lanka and in Fiji and other places. It will be the others who will be facing the brunt and will have to adapt in various ways until the eventual inundation takes place, right? So we have to understand how localities are affected and what that means. One of the things that means is that there will be transnational commonalities of how climate change manifests itself in terms of the risk and the vulnerability. What that also means that knowledge and resources are also unevenly distributed. So access to knowledge and resources will determine adaptation successes in future. What that also means is that translocal collaboration will become increasingly important. For instance, the Maldivians have to start collaborating with Pacific Islanders right away. If I'm to give a more example at home, for instance, what happens at 3,000 feet across the Himalayas will be different from what happens at 6,000 feet altitude across the Himalayas. So in that sense, Bhutan, Nepal, India, Pakistan, and perhaps even Afghanistan will have common problems at 3,000 feet, common problems at the plains, and common problems at the high mountains. And of course, I mentioned 5 countries. That's how we're divided when we look at the territory. So it's the translocal collaboration. It's more meaningful for people living in 3,000 feet in Bhutan to start talking to people living in 3,000 feet in India and in Nepal than for them to start talking about their compatriots at the, in the plains or in the mountains. So when we look at how this is evolving, it looks like that organizations that can move knowledge and resources across boundaries and promote translocal collaboration will have a critical role to play. This role is being played. There are organizations that do this, but they haven't focused on climate change. They do on other things. There are organizations that do very similar work around poverty reduction or other issues or women's empowerment and so on and so forth. But on climate change, this initiation has been very weak. So, but can then, international nonprofits do anything about this, or I can do? All right, I can get to the slide at least. All right, so what can international nonprofits bring to the table? The first is their ability to tap global resources and bring them to local communities. This has been a standard function of all international nonprofits. They have to start now looking into climate change and see how they can adapt to the new challenge and trying to bring these resources to local communities, across the globe. The other thing is the scope to transfer knowledge, resources, and practices across boundaries. Again, this has been a strength of the nonprofits for a long time, particularly international nonprofits. That has to be leveraged in the problems of climate change, particularly vulnerability issues. The third is the scope to convene translocal communities in common platforms and promote translocal collaboration. Let me give you a quick example. So the South Asian granary of Punjab is divided by a line that divides India and Pakistan. There's been a long-standing problem of groundwater depletion there, and then our food security has been gradually threatened. And on top, you have inundation and floods and so on and so forth. But the farmers in Punjab, in India, can't talk to the farmers in the Pakistani Punjab. So these kinds of sort of boundaries that we've created will become a problem later, and somebody will have to bridge it. And so the organizations that can convene across boundaries will become more and more important. The fourth idea is that the ability to create an interface between science, local innovations, and policy will become important. Why? Because people who do science or deep science are not well versed in the politics of policy. People who do policy aren't entirely well versed in science. Both of them barely talk to local people, local communities, and what is happening in terms of local innovations. Local innovations never get validated. in most instances, we saw yesterday Mr. Sonam Wangchuk talking about his idea of accumulating winter ice for flow augmentation in irrigation canals in summer. Now, if that begins to work, who is likely to pick it up? Will there scientists descending in Ladakh or not? My experience tells me perhaps not. So those kind of practices can be moved through other agencies that can do a better job at it. And I feel that international nonprofits have been doing that for some time, and they need to begin to do more. The last point I want to make is there is for almost 50, 60 years now, the development field has had sort of developed a very deep understanding of what the politics of development has been. Similarly, that understanding can be translated into politics of vulnerability around climate change. And that includes thinking about justice, thinking about equity, and thinking about inclusion. And so these ideas that have sort of been nurtured and cultivated, in sort of internal and external settings of these organizations have to travel over and start, in that space where we're thinking of solutions for climate change and vulnerability. And that's my last point. Thank you very much.